pregnant wife he was divorcing had tears streaming down her face. But Derek Mitchell didn't care. He slapped her anyway at her own baby shower while his mistress Brittany laughed and pointed from across the room. Evelyn Harper was 8 months pregnant and had just been served divorce papers in front of 50 guests. But the public humiliation was only beginning because Derek's mother Patricia was already marching toward her with fury in her eyes. But Derek was completely unaware that the woman he had just struck was the only daughter of Victor Harrington, the trillionaire boss whose empire spanned banking, real estate, technology, and media, a man who had been watching his daughter suffer in silence for 3 long years. The mistress laughed as she watched the pregnant wife crumple to the floor, but she had no idea she was witnessing the last peaceful moment of her entire life. Derek had just slapped his soon-to-be ex-wife in the middle of her own baby shower, and everyone in the room remained completely silent, too afraid of his family's influence to say a single word. Derek's mother walked over with cruel satisfaction in her eyes and kicked her out personally, dragging her pregnant body toward the door while 50 guests pretended not to see. "You should have known your place, you worthless nobody," the mother hissed loud enough for everyone to hear. But knowing one's place was about to take on an entirely different meaning for this arrogant family. In the weeks that followed, what the humiliated pregnant wife did shocked every single person who had witnessed her degradation. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She didn't even raise her voice or hire a lawyer. But somehow, within 60 short days, Derek found himself completely and utterly bankrupt. His family's $100 million construction empire collapsed without warning. The laughing mistress was abandoned and left with absolutely nothing, not even the clothes on her back. And the mother who had kicked out a pregnant woman at her own baby shower, she was reduced to begging on social media for strangers, anyone at all, to help her buy groceries. How did one quiet, bleeding, humiliated pregnant woman dismantle an entire empire without ever raising her voice? Why did she hide her identity as a trillionaire boss's daughter for 5 long, painful years of marriage? What exactly made Derek slap the woman carrying his own child at her own baby shower in front of 50 witnesses? What dark secret about the laughing mistress finally pushed this impossibly patient wife to unleash her true, terrifying power? And what did Derek discover about his own family that left him more shocked than the bankruptcy itself? This story will teach you why the quiet ones are always the most dangerous to betray, why you should never mistake patience for weakness, and why the person serving you coffee today might own the building you're standing in tomorrow. Stay until the very end, because what Derek screamed when he discovered the truth will change how you treat every single person you meet for the rest of your life. The ballroom of the Grandview Hotel had been transformed into a paradise of pink and white ribbons, but the decorations now felt like a cruel joke as Evelyn Harper stood trembling in the center of the room with divorce papers clutched in her shaking hands. She had spent weeks planning this baby shower for her unborn daughter, but she never imagined that her husband would choose this moment, this sacred celebration of new life, to destroy everything she had built. Derek Mitchell stood before her with cold eyes and a colder heart, but the man she had married 3 years ago had once looked at her with warmth and promises of forever. "Sign the papers, Evelyn," Derek commanded loud enough for every guest to hear, but his voice carried no trace of the love he had once whispered in her ear. "I want this divorce finalized before that baby is born." The 50 guests sat frozen in their seats, but none of them moved to help the pregnant woman whose world was crumbling before their eyes. Evelyn's hands trembled as she looked down at the legal documents, but the words blurred through her tears as she tried to comprehend how her fairy tale had turned into a nightmare. She had given up everything for this man, her family's wealth, her father's protection, her rightful place as heir to a $1 trillion empire. But Derek had never known about any of it because she had wanted him to love her for herself alone. "Derek, please," Evelyn whispered with her voice breaking, but her plea only seemed to irritate him further. "Can we talk about this privately? The baby—" But before she could finish her sentence, Derek's hand flew through the air and connected with her cheek in a slap that echoed through the silent ballroom. The sound was deafening, but the gasp that followed from the crowd was even louder. Evelyn stumbled backward with her hand flying to her burning face, but she managed to stay on her feet despite the shock radiating through her pregnant body. "Don't you dare use that baby to manipulate me," Derek snarled with venom dripping from every word, but his eyes held no remorse for the violence he had just committed. "I know you trapped me with this pregnancy, but I won't let you ruin my life any longer." From across the room, a sharp laugh pierced through the horrified silence, but it wasn't a laugh of disbelief, it was a laugh of triumph. Brittany Cole stepped forward from the shadows with her designer heels, clicking against the marble floor, but the dress she wore had been purchased with money from Derek and Evelyn's joint account. She was tall, blonde, and beautiful in a plastic sort of way, but her eyes held a cruelty that matched the smile spreading across her painted lips. "Finally," Brittany announced to the room, with her arms snaking around Derek's waist, but her gaze remained fixed on Evelyn's tear-stained face. "I've been waiting for months to take my rightful place, but this pathetic little housewife just wouldn't let go." Evelyn's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her collapse. She had suspected the affair for months, but seeing Brittany draped over her husband at her own baby shower was a betrayal she could never have prepared for. The other woman's laugh continued to ring through the ballroom, but Evelyn noticed something that neither Derek nor his mistress had spotted: the small red light of a security camera blinking in the corner of the ceiling. But the humiliation wasn't over yet. Patricia Mitchell, Derek's mother, rose from her seat at the head table with a look of disgust twisting her features, but her anger wasn't directed at her son for his violence. It was aimed squarely at Evelyn. The older woman had never approved of her son's marriage to a nobody, but she had tolerated Evelyn only because she had believed the young woman would produce an heir for the Mitchell family. "You worthless girl," Patricia hissed, as she marched toward Evelyn with her finger pointing accusingly, but her designer jewelry glinted under the chandelier lights as she moved. "You couldn't even keep my son happy, but you expect us to celebrate your pregnancy? This child is probably not even Derek's." The accusation hung in the air like poison, but Evelyn knew the truth. The baby growing inside her was undoubtedly Derek's daughter. She opened her mouth to defend herself, but Patricia had already grabbed her by the arm, with surprising strength for a woman of her age. "Get out," Patricia commanded as she dragged Evelyn toward the exit, but the pregnant woman struggled to keep her balance on the polished floor. "You are no longer welcome in this family, but don't think for a moment that you'll get a single penny from my son." The double doors burst open to reveal a torrential rainstorm outside, but Patricia showed no mercy as she shoved Evelyn into the cold, wet darkness. The pregnant woman stumbled down the steps, with her beautiful dress immediately soaked through, but she turned back one last time to see Derek, watching from the doorway with Brittany wrapped around him like a snake. But none of them knew that 3 black SUVs had just pulled into the parking lot, and inside the lead vehicle sat Victor Harrington, the trillionaire boss who had just watched his only daughter get slapped, humiliated, and thrown into the rain. The rain pounded against Evelyn's skin like 1,000 tiny needles, but the physical cold was nothing compared to the ice that had formed around her broken heart. She stood alone on the wet pavement with her arms wrapped protectively around her swollen belly, but the baby inside her kicked as if sensing her mother's distress. 3 years of marriage had ended in public humiliation, but Evelyn had never imagined that the man she loved would raise his hand against her while she carried his child. But then she heard the sound of car doors opening behind her. Evelyn turned slowly with rainwater streaming down her face, but what she saw made her breath catch in her throat. 3 black SUVs had formed a protective semicircle around her, but it was the man stepping out of the lead vehicle that made her knees nearly buckle. Victor Harrington stood tall despite his 62 years, but his silver hair and tailored suit were already getting soaked as he rushed toward his daughter with an expression that mixed rage with heartbreak. "Daddy," Evelyn whispered with her voice cracking, but the word felt foreign on her lips after 3 years of pretending she had no family. "How did you—" But Victor didn't let her finish as he wrapped his arms around her trembling form and pulled her against his chest. "I've been watching over you every single day, sweetheart," he murmured into her wet hair, but his voice carried a dangerous edge that Evelyn recognized from her childhood. "I had hoped that boy would prove himself worthy of you, but tonight he showed me exactly what kind of man he truly is." The memory of how she had met Derek flashed through Evelyn's mind, but the sweetness of that first encounter now tasted bitter on her tongue. She had been 22 years old and desperate to escape the golden cage of her father's empire, but she had wanted to experience life as an ordinary woman, to be loved for herself rather than her billions. Victor had reluctantly agreed to let her live anonymously for 1 year, but that year had turned into 3 when she fell in love with a charming young accountant named Derek Mitchell. But Derek's charm had been nothing more than a carefully constructed mask. "I should have listened to you," Evelyn sobbed against her father's chest, but the guilt of her choices weighed heavily on her shoulders. "You warned me that he was only after money, but I thought I could prove you wrong by hiding who I really was." Victor pulled back slightly to look into his daughter's eyes, but the tenderness in his gaze couldn't hide the fury simmering beneath the surface. "You wanted to believe in love, sweetheart, but some men don't deserve that belief." He gently touched the red mark on her cheek where Derek had struck her, but his jaw tightened with barely controlled rage. "But now it's time to show them exactly who they've been mistreating." Inside the ballroom, the party had resumed with an almost desperate energy, but Derek Mitchell had no idea that his entire world was about to collapse. He stood at the bar with Brittany pressed against his side and a champagne glass in his hand, but his mother Patricia was already circulating among the guests to spin the narrative in their favor. The story she told painted Evelyn as a mentally unstable gold digger, but the security cameras mounted in every corner of the room had captured a very different truth. But Derek's phone suddenly buzzed with an urgent notification. He glanced down at the screen with mild irritation, but the color drained from his face as he read the message from his boss at Henderson Financial Group. The text was brief but devastating. "Emergency meeting tomorrow morning. Don't be late." But what Derek didn't know was that Henderson Financial Group was a subsidiary of Harrington Industries, and Victor Harrington had just made a very important phone call. Meanwhile, Brittany was scrolling through her own phone with a smug smile, but her expression faltered when she noticed that her Instagram account had been suspended without explanation. She had spent years building her influencer brand with carefully curated photos of luxury items, but every single brand partnership she had secured was connected to companies owned by the Harrington Empire. But she brushed off the notification as a technical glitch, never suspecting that her entire online presence was about to be erased. Patricia Mitchell was oblivious to the storm gathering around her family, but she continued to hold court among the wealthy guests with stories of how she had saved her son from a terrible marriage. She boasted about the Mitchell family's prestigious reputation, but she had no idea that the Harrington name carried more power than 100 Mitchell dynasties combined. The older woman had always looked down on Evelyn for her apparent lack of family connections, but she was about to discover that some families prefer to wield their power from the shadows. But back outside in the rain, Victor Harrington was helping his daughter into the warm interior of his SUV with a protective gentleness that contrasted sharply with the vengeance burning in his eyes. "What happens now, Daddy?" Evelyn asked as she settled into the leather seat, but her hand remained pressed against her belly where her daughter was still kicking. Victor's smile was cold as he climbed in beside her, but his hand reached out to cover hers with paternal warmth. "Now, sweetheart, we remind Derek Mitchell and his family why the Harrington name is feared in every boardroom across this country." He paused as the SUV pulled away from the hotel, but his next words sent a chill down Evelyn's spine despite the vehicle's warmth. "But first, I want him to understand exactly what he lost when he raised his hand against my daughter." The convoy of black SUVs disappeared into the stormy night, but inside the ballroom, Derek Mitchell was laughing at a joke Brittany had just told, completely unaware that he had just slapped the woman whose father could destroy him with a single phone call. But the destruction wouldn't come with a phone call. It would come with a hurricane. The morning sun rose over the city like a golden promise of new beginnings. But for Derek Mitchell, this day would mark the beginning of his complete and utter destruction. He walked into the Henderson Financial Group headquarters with his usual arrogant stride, but the receptionist who normally greeted him with a warm smile wouldn't even meet his eyes. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt longer than usual, but Derek dismissed his unease as residual tension from the previous night's events. But nothing could have prepared him for what awaited behind those boardroom doors. 12 executives sat around the polished mahogany table with expressions that ranged from pity to barely concealed satisfaction. But it was the man at the head of the table who made Derek's blood run cold. He had never met Victor Harrington in person, but every financial professional in the country knew that face. The trillionaire boss whose empire controlled banks, media conglomerates, technology, firms, and real estate holdings worth more than most nations' GDP. "Mr. Mitchell," Victor said with a voice as smooth as aged whiskey, but twice as intoxicating, "please have a seat. We have much to discuss." Derek's legs moved mechanically toward the empty chair, but his mind was racing to understand why the most powerful businessman in America was sitting in his company's boardroom. "Mr. Harrington, this is an unexpected honor, but I'm not sure why—" "You're not sure why I'm here?" Victor interrupted with a cold smile, but his eyes held no warmth whatsoever. "Then allow me to enlighten you, but first, I want to show you something." A massive screen on the wall flickered to life, but the image that appeared made Derek's heart stop beating. The security footage from the baby shower played in crystal clear definition, showing him slapping Evelyn across the face while Brittany laughed in the background. But the video didn't stop there. It continued to show Patricia grabbing Evelyn and throwing her out into the rain while Derek watched with his arm around his mistress. "That woman you struck," Victor continued with his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "is my daughter, but I suspect you already figured that out." The color drained from Derek's face like water from a broken vessel, but his mouth opened and closed without producing any sound. His mind flashed back to every moment of his marriage, every time Evelyn had quietly endured his complaints about money, every instance where she had hidden her pain behind a gentle smile, every occasion when she had chosen love over luxury. But he had never suspected that his poor, orphaned wife was the sole heir to a trillion-dollar empire. "I don't understand," Derek finally managed to stammer, but his voice sounded weak even to his own ears. "Evelyn told me she had no family, but she never mentioned she wanted to be loved for who she was, not what she owned." Victor cut him off with disgust dripping from every syllable. "But you couldn't even manage that simple task." He leaned forward with his hands clasped on the table, but his posture radiated the controlled power of a predator about to strike. "My daughter gave up everything for you. Her inheritance, her family, her rightful place in society, but you repaid her devotion with infidelity and violence." But Victor wasn't finished delivering his devastating blows. "As of this morning, Henderson Financial Group is under new management," he announced while gesturing to the executives around the table. But that's just the beginning of your problems, Mr. Mitchell. He slid a folder across the table toward Derek, but the younger man's hands trembled too violently to open it. Inside that folder, you'll find documentation showing that your mortgage has been called due immediately. But since I now own your bank, I'm afraid no extensions will be granted. Derek's world was crumbling around him like a sandcastle in a tsunami, but the waves of destruction kept coming without mercy. My startup, he whispered with sudden realization dawning in his eyes. The investors who funded my business. All subsidiaries of Harrington Industries, Victor confirmed with a satisfied nod, but I've already instructed them to withdraw their funding, effective immediately. He stood from his chair with the grace of a man who had won countless battles, but his eyes never left Derek's terrified face. You wanted to divorce my daughter and leave her with nothing, but now you'll understand what nothing truly feels like. But the final blow came from an unexpected direction. Derek's phone buzzed with a notification from Brittany, but the message on his screen made his stomach drop to the floor. She had sent him a screenshot of her empty bank account, along with a single sentence. Your father-in-law froze all my accounts. I'm done with you. But attached to the message was a photo of Brittany boarding a plane, alone and clearly fleeing from the catastrophe that Derek had brought upon them both. Your mistress appears to have abandoned you, Victor observed with mock sympathy, but I'm sure your mother will stand by your side through the difficult times ahead. His smile turned predatory as he walked toward the door, but he paused with his hand on the handle. Oh, I almost forgot. I've also purchased the country club where Patricia Mitchell has been a member for 30 years, but unfortunately her membership has been revoked due to conduct unbecoming of our establishment. But before Derek could respond, his phone rang with his mother's hysterical voice, screaming about humiliation and bankruptcy, and Victor Harrington walked out of the boardroom with the satisfied smile of a father who had just avenged his daughter's tears. 6 months had passed since the baby shower that destroyed Derek Mitchell's life, but the man who once walked with arrogance now shuffled through the streets with the broken posture of someone who had lost everything. His designer suits had been sold to pay legal fees, but the money had barely covered a fraction of his mounting debts. The apartment he now rented was smaller than the closet in his former home, but even this modest dwelling would soon be lost because he couldn't afford next month's rent. But today, Derek had swallowed what remained of his pride to do the unthinkable. He stood outside the towering glass skyscraper of Harrington Industries with his hands trembling at his sides, but the security guards at the entrance recognized him immediately from the photos that had circulated through every department. The viral video of him slapping a pregnant woman had destroyed his reputation in every industry. But Derek had convinced himself that Evelyn's kind heart might still grant him mercy. He had rehearsed his apology 1,000 times, but the words felt hollow even in his own mind. I need to see Evelyn Harper, Derek told the receptionist with desperation cracking his voice, but please tell her that her ex-husband is here to apologize. The receptionist's eyebrow raised with barely concealed contempt, but she picked up the phone and relayed the message to the executive floor. Derek waited in the marble lobby with his heart pounding against his ribs, but every passing minute felt like an eternity of judgment from the well-dressed employees who whispered and pointed in his direction. But then the elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Evelyn Harper stepped into the lobby with the commanding presence of a woman who had finally claimed her birthright, but the infant cradled in her arms softened the power radiating from her designer outfit. She looked nothing like the timid housewife Derek had married 3 years ago, but the transformation went far deeper than her expensive clothes and perfectly styled hair. Her eyes held a strength that had always been there, but Derek had been too blind and too arrogant to recognize it. Derek, Evelyn acknowledged with a voice as cool as winter marble. But I must admit, I'm surprised you had the courage to show your face here. Derek dropped to his knees on the polished floor without any concern for the spectacle he was creating. But his eyes were fixed on the baby girl in Evelyn's arms, the daughter he had never met. "Please, Evelyn, I'm begging you," he pleaded, with tears streaming down his unshaven face. "But I've lost everything. My job, my home, my savings. It's all gone." "And whose fault is that?" Evelyn asked with one eyebrow raised, but she made no move to help him off the floor. "I gave you 3 years of unconditional love, but you repaid me with betrayal and violence." But Derek's desperation pushed him to reach for his final card. The baby," he gasped while pointing at the infant with shaking fingers. "She's my daughter too, but you can't keep her from me forever. I have rights as her father, but I'm willing to sign them away if you'll just help me get back on my feet." The lobby fell silent as every employee stopped to witness this pathetic display. But Evelyn's expression never wavered from its mask of composed indifference. She looked down at the man who had once made her feel worthless, but she felt nothing except a distant pity for how far he had fallen. "You want to sell your parental rights for money?" Evelyn repeated with disgust coloring her tone, but her arms tightened protectively around her daughter. "But that tells me everything I need to know about the kind of father you would have been." But Evelyn had one final truth to deliver. "I never needed your money, Derek, but I wanted your love," she said while stepping closer to look down at his kneeling form. "I hid my identity because I wanted to build a life based on genuine connection, but you showed me that your love was always conditional on what you could gain." She paused to let her words sink into his broken spirit, but her voice softened slightly with her next sentence. "My daughter will grow up knowing her worth, but she will never know the father who tried to sell her for a financial bailout." Security guards materialized at Derek's sides to escort him from the building, but he continued to beg and plead, even as they dragged him toward the exit. The glass doors closed behind him with a finality that echoed through his hollow chest. But Evelyn had already turned away to return to her office. But as the elevator doors closed around her, Evelyn allowed herself one small smile of triumph. She had entered her marriage as a trillionaire's daughter, pretending to be ordinary, but she emerged as a mother, an executive, and a woman who had finally learned that true love cannot be tested into existence. It must be freely given by those worthy of receiving it. And Derek Mitchell, the man who had slapped his pregnant wife at her baby shower while his mistress laughed, would spend the rest of his life knowing that his cruelty had cost him not just a fortune, but a family that money could never buy. But that was the price of arrogance, and some debts can never be repaid. The autumn leaves danced across the manicured lawn of the Harrington estate, like golden whispers of time passing, but the little girl chasing them moved with the carefree joy of someone who had never known suffering. Her name was Hope Harrington, and at 5 years old, she was already the pride of her grandfather's empire, but more importantly, she was the center of her mother's entire universe. But today was a special day that would close one chapter forever. Evelyn stood on the terrace watching her daughter play with a gentle smile on her face, but her thoughts drifted to the journey that had brought her to this moment of peace. 5 years had passed since that terrible night at the baby shower, but the scars of betrayal had healed into wisdom that she now wore like armor. She had transformed from a naive young bride into the CEO of Harrington Media Group. But her greatest accomplishment wasn't her corner office. It was the resilient, compassionate woman she had become. "Mommy, look," Hope called out while holding up a perfectly red maple leaf, but her bright eyes sparkled with the same intensity that Evelyn remembered seeing in her own father's gaze. "It's the most beautiful one I've ever found." "It's absolutely perfect, sweetheart," Evelyn replied with warmth flooding her voice, but she noticed her father approaching from the house with an envelope in his weathered hands. Victor Harrington had aged gracefully, over the past 5 years, but the fire in his eyes had never dimmed, especially when it came to protecting his daughter and granddaughter. But the envelope he carried would bring news from an unexpected source. "This arrived for you today," Victor said, while handing the letter to Evelyn, but his expression revealed that he already knew its contents. "It's from Derek Mitchell, but you don't have to read it if you'd prefer not to." Evelyn took the envelope with steady hands that no longer trembled at the mention of her ex-husband's name. But curiosity compelled her to break the seal and unfold the single page inside. The handwriting was shaky and desperate, but the words painted a picture of a man who had finally reached rock bottom. But Derek's letter wasn't a plea for money this time. "Dear Evelyn," she read silently to herself, but each sentence revealed the depth of his transformation through suffering. "I am writing this from a homeless shelter in Detroit, but I am not asking for your help or your forgiveness. 5 years ago, I destroyed the most precious gift I had ever been given, but I was too blind to see your worth until I lost everything. I slapped you while you carried our daughter, but that moment haunts me every night when I close my eyes. I watched Brittany laugh at your pain, but she abandoned me the moment your father took away her comfortable life. My mother blamed me for our family's downfall, but she passed away last winter still cursing your name with her final breath." But the letter's conclusion carried an unexpected confession. "I have spent 5 years learning what it means to have nothing, but I finally understand the treasure I threw away. You loved me without conditions, but I repaid you with cruelty and betrayal. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want you to know that I am truly sorry, not because I lost your father's money, but because I lost the woman who would have loved me through poverty or wealth. Please tell Hope that her father was once a monster, but even monsters can learn to feel remorse. I will never contact you again, but I needed you to know that you were right about everything." Evelyn folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope, but she felt no satisfaction or vindication from Derek's suffering. She had learned long ago that revenge was a poison that destroyed the vessel carrying it, but she had also discovered that forgiveness was not the same as reconciliation. "What will you do?" Victor asked while watching his daughter's contemplative expression, but he already knew that Evelyn's heart was too kind for permanent hatred. But Evelyn's answer surprised even herself. "I will pray that he finds peace," she said, while turning to watch Hope gather more leaves in her tiny hands. "But I will also teach my daughter that some bridges must remain burned for our protection." She leaned against her father's shoulder with gratitude swelling in her chest, but her eyes remained fixed on the little girl who represented everything good that had emerged from her darkest chapter. "Derek taught me that not everyone deserves access to our hearts, but he also showed me the kind of mother I needed to become." Hope came running toward them with her arms full of autumn treasures, but her laughter rang across the estate like bells announcing a new season. And Evelyn finally understood that her story had never been about revenge, or wealth, or even justice, but about discovering that her true worth had never depended on anyone's recognition except her own. But that was the greatest lesson of all. Some storms come to destroy us, but the strongest souls learn to dance in the rain, and then teach their daughters to do the same.